Why you suddenly started seeing 555 everywhere. The threshold feeling. Something in your life is already breaking apart. You can feel it. You just haven't been able to name it yet. And right in the middle of that feeling, that low, unplaceable pressure that follows you from the moment you wake up, a number keeps appearing. 555. On the clock before you're fully awake. On a receipt you almost threw away. On a license plate at the exact moment your mind went quiet. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It just appears. Again and again. In the margins of ordinary moments with a frequency that has stopped feeling accidental. Here's what nobody tells you about 555. It doesn't appear when life is stable. It doesn't show up during the seasons when things feel settled, when your direction is clear and your internal world feels coherent. It appears during a very specific condition, one that most people are living inside for weeks or months before they even recognize it for what it is. A condition where something that used to feel like you has started to feel like a version of you that no longer fits. Where a structure you built your life around, a relationship, a path, an identity, a belief about what your future was supposed to look like, has begun to quietly lose its coherence. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that you notice the silence where certainty used to be. That's the moment 555 finds you, not after the change, not to announce that something beautiful is on its way. It finds you in the middle of the fracture, in the space between who you have been and who you are being forced to become. And if you've been seeing it with the kind of frequency that made you search for this video, that means the fracture is already deeper than you've allowed yourself to admit. This is not a video about comfort. It's not going to tell you that the signs mean everything will work out, or that you are protected, or that the universe has a plan. What it's going to do is something far more useful. It's going to show you the exact internal architecture of what you're moving through right now. Why 555 appears at this specific moment in a person's life, what it is actually pointing toward, and what it is going to require from you before this period is over. Because here's what you need to understand before anything else. The number didn't cause the feeling. The feeling called the number. And that distinction changes everything about how you read what is happening to you right now. Pay attention to what comes next. Why this number? Why now? Most people approach 555 as if the number itself is the message. They search for its meaning the way you'd look up a word in a dictionary, expecting a clean definition, a contained explanation, something they can file away and reference later. And what they find is usually some version of the same thing. Change is coming. Transformation is near. A new chapter is beginning, and they close the tab feeling vaguely reassured but not actually answered, because the question that brought them there wasn't really what does 555 mean. It was something more personal and more destabilizing than that. It was, why is this happening to me right now at this specific moment in my life? That question deserves a real answer. 555 is not a number that distributes itself evenly across the timeline of a life. People don't see it consistently for years on end. They see it in clusters, concentrated periods where it appears with a frequency that feels deliberate. And then eventually the sightings slow, the intensity fades, and life settles into a different register. The cluster always corresponds to something, not an external event necessarily, not a visible change in circumstances, something internal, a shift in the underlying structure of who a person is in relation to the life they are living. Think about the last time your life felt genuinely stable, not perfect, stable, where the version of yourself you were presenting to the world felt reasonably aligned with the version of yourself you experienced privately, where your relationships, your direction, your sense of identity had a coherence that didn't require constant maintenance to hold together. If you can locate that feeling, you will likely notice that 555 was not particularly present during that time. Now think about where you are now. Something has shifted. Maybe gradually over months. Maybe suddenly in the aftermath of something that changed the shape of your daily life. But something in the internal architecture, the story you were telling yourself about who you are and where you are going, has developed a fracture, not a collapse. A fracture, the kind you can almost ignore if you stay busy enough. The kind that only becomes visible in the quiet moments, when the distractions fall away and something underneath surfaces that you're not quite ready to look at directly. That is precisely the condition in which 555 appears. It is not a number for stable lives. It is a number for lives in motion, specifically for the motion that happens beneath the surface, before anything external has visibly changed. It appears when a person's internal world has already begun its transition, even when the external world still looks the same as it did 6 months ago. This is why the timing always feels significant to the people who experience it. Because it is significant. The number is not appearing in spite of what you're going through, it's appearing because of it. Because something in you has crossed a threshold that most of you hasn't consciously acknowledged yet. And the repeated appearance of 555 is, in the most precise sense, a reflection of where you actually are right now. Not where you wish you were. Not where you're pretending to be. Where you actually are. And where you actually are right now is standing at the edge of something you haven't fully looked at yet. A restlessness that has been building longer than the number has been appearing. A feeling that existed before the first sighting, before the first search, before this video. A feeling that, if you are honest with yourself, you have been aware of for some time. That feeling is where we need to go next. The restlessness before the change. It didn't start with the number. That's important to understand. The restlessness came first. It came in the form of small discomforts you couldn't quite locate. A vague dissatisfaction with things that used to feel sufficient. A creeping awareness that the life you are living, which looks reasonable from the outside, which contains things you genuinely value, has started to feel slightly too small or slightly misaligned in a way you struggle to justify to anyone else because nothing is visibly wrong. You're not in crisis. You haven't lost anything obvious. You just feel like you're living in a house that used to fit and quietly, without announcement, stopped fitting somewhere along the way. That feeling is not a problem. It is information. There is a specific window in any major life transition that almost nobody talks about. The period before the transition becomes visible. Before the relationship ends. Before the career path shifts. Before the move happens. Before the old structure finally gives way to something new. In that window, a person's internal world has already begun to reorganize itself around a different center of gravity. Old certainties start to feel less certain. Things that used to provide comfort start to feel slightly hollow. The future that once felt clear and motivating starts to feel like a story you're no longer sure you wrote for yourself. This is the window in which 555 appears. Most people in this window do one of two things. The first is suppression, doubling down on the existing structure, filling the quiet with activity, telling themselves the discomfort is temporary, that they simply need to push through or be more grateful, or try harder at the life they already have. The second is anxiety, interpreting the internal shift as evidence that something is wrong with them, that they are broken or ungrateful, or fundamentally incapable of being satisfied, rather than recognizing that the discomfort has a source and the source is legitimate. Neither response addresses what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that a version of your life has reached its natural limit. Not because it was a failure, not because you made wrong choices, but because you have grown past the shape it was built around. The person who chose the path you are currently on made that choice from a particular set of needs, fears, understandings, and visions of the future. Some of those things are still true. Others have quietly become outdated, and the gap between who you were when you built this life and who you are now has grown wide enough that your internal world can no longer pretend it isn't there. The restlessness is that gap making itself felt, and 555 appears in the middle of it not to intensify the discomfort, but to mark it, to indicate that what you are feeling has a name, has a structure, has a direction, that the unease is not chaos. It is the leading edge of something that is already in motion, something that began moving before you consciously authorized it, because genuine transitions rarely wait for permission. The question is not whether something is changing. At this point, if you are honest with yourself, you already know something is changing. The question is, what specifically you have been holding on to that the change is asking you to release. Because 555 never appears in a vacuum. It always appears in relation to something specific, something that has quietly become misaligned, something that a part of you is already aware of, even if the rest of you hasn't caught up yet. That is what the next chapter is about. What you were holding on to. There is something you have been carrying that has become heavier than it should be. You may know exactly what it is, or you may have a sense of it, a peripheral awareness, something you approach and then move away from, something that surfaces in the quiet and retreats when you get busy again. Either way, it is there, and 555 is in large part a mirror reflecting the energetic strain of continuing to hold it. Attachment during transition takes many forms. Sometimes it is a relationship, one that has genuinely run its course, where the connection that once felt generative has become static or draining, but where the prospect of its absence is frightening enough that the mind constructs endless justifications for its continuation. Sometimes it is an identity, a role, a self-image, a way of being seen by others that has become a structure you maintain rather than a truth you inhabit. Sometimes it is a path, a career, a direction, a version of the future you committed to at a point in your life when it felt aligned, and which now costs more to sustain than it returns. And sometimes it is something subtler than any of these. Sometimes what a person is holding on to is simply a version of themselves, a way of understanding who they are and what they are capable of, that has become too small for what they are actually becoming. And releasing that is in some ways the most disorienting of all, because it requires letting go of something you thought was simply you. Here is what 555 reflects about attachment. The strain of holding on shows up energetically before it shows up externally. Before a person consciously decides to leave a relationship, there is often months or years of internal energy spent maintaining it against the current of what is genuinely true. Before a career shift becomes visible, there is often a long period of private exhaustion, the weight of showing up daily for something that no longer resonates at a fundamental level. The external change is almost always preceded by an internal condition of sustained effort, of holding something in place that is trying, by its own natural momentum, to move. That effort has a cost, and 555 frequently appears during periods when that cost has become significant enough to be undeniable, when the gap between what you are maintaining and what is actually true has grown too wide to sustain without consequence. This does not mean you need to immediately dismantle everything. It does not mean that what you are holding on to has no value, or that releasing it will be simple or painless. What it means is that something in your current structure has reached the point where continuing to hold it in its present form is no longer compatible with the direction your life is actually trying to move. The question 555 is asking you, quietly, repeatedly, in the margins of ordinary moments, is not what are you afraid of losing. It is something more direct than that. It is, what have you already lost that you haven't yet admitted to yourself? That question is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be, because the answer to it is where the real movement begins, the pattern recognition phenomenon. At some point, a rational part of your mind has probably raised an objection to all of this. Something that sounds like, isn't it possible that I'm simply noticing 555 more because I noticed it once? Isn't this just confirmation bias? Isn't the mind simply finding patterns because it is wired to find patterns? Yes. And also, that objection, while partially valid, misses the most important part of what is actually happening. The human mind does not increase its pattern recognition capacity randomly. It does not begin noticing specific recurring symbols during periods of emotional stability, contentment, or routine. The heightened awareness that causes a person to suddenly notice a number with unusual frequency does not emerge from a neutral state. It emerges from a state of internal activation, from a mind that is at some level searching, processing, attempting to find structure and meaning in an experience of internal disruption that doesn't yet have a clear narrative framework. In other words, the fact that your mind is noticing 555 is itself meaningful. Not because the number is appearing more frequently in the world, it is almost certainly appearing at the same rate it always has. but because something in your internal state has shifted in a way that makes your mind receptive to it, attuned to it, pulled toward it in a way that wasn't happening before. Carl Jung called this synchronicity, the experience of meaningful coincidence where an external event and an internal state align in a way that feels significant beyond the reach of pure chance. His argument was not that the external world magically rearranges itself to produce signs. His argument was that when a person's consciousness reaches a particular level of activation, particularly during periods of major psychological transition, the boundary between internal experience and external perception becomes more porous. The world doesn't change. The perceiver changes, and that change in perception creates the experience of meaningful pattern. What this means practically is that the appearance of 555 in your life right now is a composite event. It is partly about the number, and it is partly about the state of consciousness you are currently in, a state that is alert, searching, and in some fundamental way ready to receive a signal it would have filtered out during a period of greater internal stability. The noticing is not a mistake, the noticing is the point, because the question worth asking is not why does this number keep appearing? The question is, why has my mind become the kind of mind that is currently attuned to this signal? What internal condition has produced a state of heightened receptivity in you? What is your consciousness searching for that it is not yet finding through the ordinary channels of your daily life? Those questions point back to everything covered in the previous chapters. The restlessness, the attachment, the quiet fracture in the existing structure. The mind that finds itself suddenly hyper-aware of a repeating pattern is a mind that is, at a deeper level, already in motion, already processing something significant, already operating in the heightened, activated state that precedes a genuine transition. The pattern recognition is not the cause of the experience. It is a symptom of it, a visible surface expression of something happening much deeper. And understanding that distinction changes the entire framework through which you read what is currently happening in your life. When the signs intensify, there comes a point where it stops feeling occasional. In the beginning, you noticed 555 with the mild curiosity of someone who has spotted something slightly unusual. You registered it, maybe searched for it once, moved on. But somewhere along the way, the frequency shifted. The sightings became more concentrated, more insistent. You started seeing it multiple times in a single day, in combinations of places that felt increasingly difficult to rationalize as coincidence. And with the increase in frequency came something else, a corresponding increase in the internal pressure that had been quietly building underneath everything. This intensification is not random, and it is not, as some people fear, a sign that something is going wrong. It is a sign that something is reaching its peak. Think of it as the energetic equivalent of a pressure system. In the natural world, the period of greatest atmospheric pressure is not the middle of the storm. It is the hours immediately before it breaks. The sky darkens. The air becomes dense and charged. Everything feels suspended in a state of heightened tension. And then, when the pressure finally releases, there is a clarity and a spaciousness on the other side that was impossible to access while the system was building. The intensification of 555 sightings corresponds to that pre-storm pressure. It marks the period of maximum internal tension in a transition, the point at which the gap between what is true and what is being maintained has become the largest it is going to get before something shifts. It is the moment of greatest proximity to the threshold, the moment where a decision, a realization, a release, or an unavoidable external change is closest to the surface. People in this phase often describe feeling simultaneously more aware and more overwhelmed, more certain that something significant is happening, and more uncertain about what to do with that certainty. The signs increase, the internal pressure increases, and the gap between knowing something needs to change and actually moving through the change feels widest. This is, paradoxically, the most important moment to remain present rather than retreat. Because the intensification is not a warning to stop. It is an indication that you are close. Close to the moment when what has been building beneath the surface finally breaks through into conscious clarity. Close to the point where the fracture in the existing structure becomes visible enough that you can no longer maintain the fiction that everything is essentially fine. The increase in 555 sightings during this phase is a marker of proximity, not danger. It means the threshold is near. It means the transition that has been building in the depths of your internal world is about to become undeniable. The question is not whether you will cross the threshold. At this stage of intensification, that is no longer really a question. The question is whether you will cross it consciously, with awareness, with intention, with some degree of preparation, or whether you will be carried across it by circumstances that force the movement before you are ready. 555 appears to give you the chance to choose the former. The numerological architecture of 555. To understand why 555 carries the weight it does, you need to understand what the number 5 actually is, not as a piece of trivia, but as a structural principle that has appeared consistently across numerological traditions, sacred geometry, and symbolic systems for thousands of years. 5 is the number of the living center. In the geometry of the natural world, 5 appears at the heart of growth and transformation. The 5-petaled flower, the 5-pointed form of the human body with arms extended, the 5-fold symmetry that appears repeatedly in biological structures that are in the process of becoming rather than remaining static. It is not a number of fixed states, it is a number of dynamic ones. In numerological tradition, 5 represents freedom, but not the comfortable kind. Not the freedom of open space and unlimited options. The freedom that 5 points toward is the freedom that comes from breaking away from a structure that has become a constraint. It is the number of disruption in service of expansion, of movement that cannot be avoided because remaining still has become more costly than moving forward. It is also the number of the threshold itself. The number 4 represents stability, structure, foundation, the 4 walls of a room, the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 seasons of a complete cycle. 5 is what happens when you step outside the room. When the stable structure of the 4 gives way to the uncertain, charged space of genuine transition. 5 is the moment of crossing, the energy of the in-between, the vibration of the person who is no longer who they were, but has not yet fully arrived at who they are becoming. When 5 appears 3 times, as 555, something specific happens to that energy. It does not simply triple. In numerological architecture, repetition creates resonance across multiple dimensions of a person's experience simultaneously. A single 5 might indicate a single area of transition, a relationship, a career, a belief. 3 5s indicate that the transition has become systemic, that it is moving through multiple layers of a person's life at once. That what is shifting is not a single aspect of who they are, but something closer to the underlying structure of how they have been living. This is why 555 feels different from other recurring numbers. It carries a weight that feels disproportionate to its simplicity. 3 identical digits, and yet the feeling it produces is unmistakably significant. That significance is built into its architecture. It is the resonance of a number whose energy operates at a structural level, not just pointing toward a change in circumstances, but toward a change in the foundational configuration of a life. There is also something worth understanding about the specific frequency of 5 in relation to the human experience of time. 4 represents completed cycles, things that have run their full course, processes that have reached their natural conclusion. 5 is what follows completion. It is the energy that exists on the far side of an ending, in the space where the old form has dissolved enough to make way for the new. When 555 appears, it is often signaling not just that something is ending, but that the ending has already happened at a deeper level. That what is being experienced as uncertainty or instability is actually the space between one completed structure and the next one that has not yet fully materialized. You are not lost. You are between. And 5, 3 times, is the vibration of exactly that place. What 555 is not telling you. Here is where it's necessary to say something that most content about angel numbers will not say to you, something that is more useful than comfortable. 555 is not a promise. It is not telling you that something wonderful is about to arrive. It is not guaranteeing that the transition you are moving through will resolve in your favor, that the relationship will heal, that the career will flourish. that the version of yourself you are becoming will be easier to inhabit than the one you are leaving behind. It is not a cosmic reassurance that you are chosen or protected, or that the universe has arranged a favorable outcome on your behalf. People want it to mean that. Understandably. When life feels destabilizing, when the internal architecture is shifting and the ground beneath a familiar structure is becoming unreliable, the desire for a sign that says it will be okay is completely human. And the spiritual content industry, books, videos, articles, has largely learned to feed that desire by interpreting angel numbers as divine endorsements of positive outcomes. That interpretation is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that makes it less useful than it could be. Here is what 555 is actually telling you. It is telling you that you are in motion, that a process of genuine transition is underway, one that has its own momentum, its own direction, and its own requirements. It is not telling you where that motion ends. It is not telling you what the new structure will look like, or whether the journey to it will be comfortable. It is telling you that the motion has begun, and that continuing to stand still, continuing to maintain structures, relationships, identities, or narratives that have already lost their coherence, is no longer compatible with the direction your life is actually moving. It is orientation, not reassurance. And the difference between those two things is significant. Reassurance asks nothing of you. It allows you to continue as you are with a slightly lighter heart, believing that external forces have arranged good things for your future. Orientation requires something. It requires that you look honestly at where you are, understand the direction you are being moved in, and make conscious choices about how you engage with that movement, rather than being carried along by it passively, or worse, actively resisting it while telling yourself the signs mean everything will be fine. The viewer who watches a video about 555 and comes away feeling comforted without being changed has missed the message. Because the message of 555 is not comfort, it is clarity. And clarity at this stage of a transition means looking directly at things you have been looking away from. It means acknowledging what you already know. It means accepting that the process you are inside of is real, that it requires something from you, and that the cost of not engaging with it honestly is greater than the cost of the discomfort that honest engagement will require. This is where a lot of people pause, because acknowledging the reality of the transition, accepting that something is genuinely ending, that something you have been holding on to has already, at a deeper level, been released, means facing the emotional weight of that, the grief of it, the fear of it. And that emotional weight is exactly what the next chapter is about. The emotional cost of transition. Nobody tells you how much it costs. Not the spiritual teachers who talk about transformation as if it is primarily an elevation, an ascent from lower to higher, from contracted to expanded, from limited to free. Not the content that frames transition as awakening, as if moving through a major life change is principally an experience of light and clarity, rather than of loss and disorientation. Not the cultural narratives that celebrate reinvention, while largely omitting the specific texture of what it feels like to be in the middle of it, before the new structure has formed, when the old one has already lost its coherence. What it actually feels like is grief. Not always the dramatic, acute grief of sudden loss, though sometimes that too. More often it is the quieter, slower grief of gradual release, the grief of watching a version of your life that you genuinely valued become something you can no longer maintain, the grief of acknowledging that a relationship, a path, a belief, or a version of yourself has run its course, even when that acknowledgement is also somewhere underneath a relief. Grief and relief are not opposites. They can inhabit the same moment with equal weight, and that combination, feeling both the loss and the liberation simultaneously, is one of the more disorienting aspects of genuine transition. There is also the grief of identity, when what is shifting is not just an external circumstance, but the internal story of who you are, the way you understood yourself in relation to the life you were living. The transition asks you to sit with a version of yourself that is between definitions, not yet clearly something new, no longer clearly what you were. And the mind, which requires coherent self-narrative in order to function with stability, experiences that in-between state as a kind of low-grade anxiety that can persist for the entire duration of the transition. This is normal. This is not a sign that something has gone wrong. This is what genuine transformation feels like from the inside. It also carries fear. Fear of the unknown shape of what is coming. Fear that the release of the old structure will leave you without sufficient foundation. Fear that the version of life you are moving toward will not be better than the one you are leaving. That the disruption will turn out to have been not a passage to something more aligned, but simply a loss with no corresponding gain. That fear is also normal. It does not mean the transition is wrong, or that you are making a mistake by moving through it. What it means is that you are human, and the human experience of genuine change is not a highlight reel. It is messy and nonlinear and emotionally expensive in ways that are difficult to explain to people who are not currently inside it. 555 does not appear to make this cost smaller. It appears to confirm that the cost is worth paying, not because it promises a specific outcome, but because its presence indicates that what you are moving through has a direction and a structure. That the disorientation is not chaos, that the grief is not the end of the story, that the in-between space you are currently inhabiting is exactly that, a between. A passage, not a destination. The emotional weight of a genuine transition is the price of a life that continues to grow past its previous limits. And recognizing it as such, not as punishment, not as failure, not as evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you, is the first act of the kind of trust that the next chapter is about. Trusting the disruption. Trust during a 555 period is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is not the warm, effortless confidence that arrives when everything is going well and the future feels clear. That is not trust. That is comfort. What is being asked of you now is something different and considerably more demanding. The capacity to continue moving forward through a period of genuine uncertainty, without the external validation that things are proceeding as they should, guided primarily by an internal sense of direction that you cannot yet fully verify. Most people, when they encounter this kind of demand, frame it as a question of faith. Do you believe enough? Do you trust the universe enough? Do you have sufficient conviction in the process? But that framing makes trust a passive state, something you either have or don't have, something that depends on the strength of a belief rather than on the quality of an engagement. A more useful framework is this. Trust during a transition is not about believing that a specific outcome will occur. It is about believing that moving through the process honestly, with awareness, with integrity, with a willingness to release what needs to be released and acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged, is more generative than remaining in a state of managed stagnation. That the discomfort of genuine movement is more productive than the security of maintained paralysis. This distinction matters because it shifts trust from a relationship with an external force or outcome into a relationship with your own process. It locates the agency inside you rather than in something external that either will or won't deliver what you hope for. And during a 555 period, when the transition is already underway and the direction is already set, the relevant question is not, do I trust that it will work out? The relevant question is, am I willing to engage with what is actually happening with honesty and intentionality? Practically, this looks like several things. It looks like acknowledging what you already know, the things you have been circling without landing on, the awarenesses that surface in the quiet and retreat when you get busy. It looks like releasing your grip on the version of the outcome you had planned, because the transition that 555 signals rarely arrives at the destination originally imagined. It looks like distinguishing between the discomfort of genuine growth and the discomfort of genuine misalignment, because they feel similar from the inside but require different responses. It also looks like patience with the pace of the process. Transitions of the depth that 555 signals do not resolve quickly. The in-between space is not a waiting room. It is an active phase of reorganization, during which the internal architecture of who you are is being reconfigured around a different center. That reconfiguration cannot be rushed. And attempting to rush it, to force clarity before it is ready, to rebuild a new structure before the old one has fully released, almost always produces a compromise that delays the genuine resolution. Trust the pace. Trust the discomfort. Trust the direction even when the destination is not yet visible. Because the disruption that 555 marks is not happening to you. It is happening through you, and you are not a passive recipient of it. You are its primary instrument. After the 555 phase, it does end. That's important to know. The 555 phase, the period of intensified sightings, heightened internal pressure, compressed uncertainty, and the particular emotional weight of living inside a genuine transition, has a duration. It is not a permanent state. It is a passage, and like all passages, it has an exit. What is on the other side of it is difficult to describe precisely, because it varies significantly depending on the nature of the transition, the depth of the engagement with it, and the specific shape of what was released during the process. But there are qualities that tend to characterize the post-555 landscape, regardless of the specific circumstances. The first is clarity, not the false clarity of having suppressed the questions, but the genuine clarity of having moved through them. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have looked honestly at what was not working, acknowledged what needed to be released, and stopped spending internal energy on the maintenance of structures that had already lost their coherence. That energy, once freed, becomes available for something else, for the construction of something new, for the pursuit of directions that were impossible to move toward while the old structure was still consuming the resources needed to sustain it. The second is a different quality of stillness, the restlessness that characterized the 555 period, that low, persistent sense that something was wrong, that something didn't fit, that something was trying to surface that hadn't yet found its form. Quiets, not because the questions have been answered definitively, but because the internal architecture has reorganized itself around something more honest. The gap between what is true and what is being maintained has narrowed or closed entirely, and the absence of that gap creates a spaciousness that the 555 period, with its compressed pressure and heightened intensity, made impossible to access. The third is perspective. Looking back at the transition from the other side of it, the period that felt most disorienting, the phase of greatest uncertainty, greatest internal pressure, most frequent 555 sightings, almost always appears as the necessary precondition for everything that followed. Not in a tidy, predetermined way, but in the way that most genuine growth appears in retrospect, as something that could only have been built on the foundation of having moved through the difficulty honestly. The number will slow down. The sightings will become less frequent, less charged, less urgent. The feeling that something is trying to communicate with you through the margins of ordinary moments will gradually give way to the feeling that you have received what was being communicated and acted on it. And when you encounter 555 again someday, on a clock, a receipt, a license plate, it will feel different than it does now. Not alarming, not heavy with the weight of unacknowledged truth. It will feel instead like a marker you recognize, a point on a map you've already navigated, evidence of a threshold you crossed and survived and grew through. The number didn't cause the change. The number found you already in motion, already in the middle of becoming something your previous life no longer had room for. It appeared in the margins of your ordinary days to do something specific, to confirm that what you were sensing was real, that the fracture was real, that the restlessness was real, that the feeling of being between who you were and who you were becoming, was not a malfunction of your psychology, but a description of your actual location. You were at a threshold. The number found you there. And what you do with the awareness that brings, how honestly you look at what is being asked of you, how consciously you engage with the transition already underway, that is entirely yours. The sign pointed the way. The movement belongs to you.